On August 5, 1959 in New York, a training flight of the American Airlines passenger aircraft Boeing 707-123 began, heading to Calverton. There were 5 crew members on board. This aircraft, with the registration number N7514A and the nickname Flagship Connecticut, usually operated flights on the transcontinental route New York-Los Angeles. However, on this day it was being used for training flights. After a successful first flight, preparations began in New York for the second one, Flight AA514. The aircraft's tanks were filled with 10,647 gallons of fuel, increasing its total weight to 38,100 kilograms, and the gross takeoff weight reached 91,360 kilograms. In the cockpit were Captain Fred Jebergean, First Officer Harry Job, Second Officer William Swain, Flight Engineer Edgar Freeman, and crew member Arthur Anderson. According to the flight plan, the crew was to follow visual flight rules first to Fire Island, and then along Air Corridor V16 to the Peconic River Airport near Calverton, which was often used for training flights. At 13:40, Flight 514 took off from Idlewild Airport. After completing planned maneuvers at altitude at 1511, the crew began their approach for landing in the Peconic River Airport area. At 1517, a dispatcher from the airline announced that after the training flight, the aircraft would be prepared for Flight AA007, New York-Los Angeles. At Calverton Airport, the crew executed a series of complex maneuvers, including full-stop landings, crosswind landings and takeoffs, high-altitude approaches, landings with engine failure, and even landings with flaps retracted. They encountered various scenarios that could arise in real flight. After practicing a missed approach with retracted flaps, the aircraft flew over runway 23 at an altitude of 300 meters when the crew reported their approach. In response, the dispatcher granted permission to land and provided wind information, indicating a wind blowing from 230 degrees at speeds of 5 to 8 meters per second. With clearance for another approach and wind information received, the crew prepared for the next stage. Subsequently, the crew simulated engine failures. They reduced the power of the right engines to a minimum and increased the power of the left engines to maximum to maintain a speed of no less than 296 kilometers per hour. At the same time, they deployed the flaps by 30 degrees and left the landing gear extended. This was a true test of their professionalism and ability to respond to emergencies. Local residents accustomed to observing training flights noticed that the Boeing flew at a low altitude and the noise from its engines was not as loud as usual. According to the flight recorder data, the aircraft executed a turn to a heading of 55 degrees, during which the speed decreased from 370 kilometers per hour to 333 kilometers per hour, and the altitude dropped from 560 meters to 520 meters. Continuing the right turn, the airliner reached a heading of 305 degrees, with the speed further decreasing to 306 kilometers per hour and the altitude to 320 meters. Heading north with a tailwind, the aircraft suddenly began to turn left to the northwest. As it crossed the extended center line of runway 23, the bank angle increased to 45 degrees, but the crew quickly corrected this with a right turn. However, the aircraft quickly began to enter a right bank at a rate of about 40 degrees per second, but the pilots seemed to not notice this. Soon the wings reached a vertical position, causing the lift to drop to zero, and the nose dropped 30 degrees. When the aircraft was already upside down, the crew realized that the situation had become critical. Therefore, they switched both right engines to takeoff mode, which they did when the Boeing had already turned approximately 270 degrees. However, the low altitude prevented them from correcting the situation. About 5 kilometers northeast of the airfield, flying on a magnetic course of 282 degrees, Flight N7514A crashed into a potato field at an angle of trajectory of 26 degrees. The aircraft was completely destroyed and burned. The catastrophe occurred at 16:42, and all 5 people on board the aircraft perished. This was the first loss in the history of the Boeing 707 aircraft. Furthermore, It was the first crash of a passenger jet in the entire United States. The aircraft crashed into the ground almost without a bank with a negative pitch of 12 degrees, with the landing gear deployed and the flaps at 30 degrees. The debris field width was almost equal to the wingspan, and its length exceeded the fuselage by approximately 1.5 times, although some small parts flew almost 150 meters away. The cockpit of the pilots was shattered into small pieces, barely recognizable, and only individual fragments remained of the bodies. The nose gear and tail were detached upon impact, but suffered minimal damage. The control surfaces were also completely destroyed, but according to investigators' assessments, the ailerons and the rudder were in a position close to neutral at the time of impact. The pilot of the light aircraft, who was nearby before the crash, stated that the distance between the aircraft was 240 to 310 meters, and thus there was no threat of collision, so the crew did not take any evasive maneuvers. The investigation into the causes of the aviation disaster was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB. The possibility of control failure was considered, but due to significant destruction, proving or disproving it was not possible. All 4 JT3C6 engines detached upon impact but remained in the crash area. Expert analysis showed that all engines were operating at full power upon impact, with the right engines suffering more damage compared to the left ones. Examination of the aircraft's maintenance history revealed nothing suspicious. Regarding the left turn, there is a possibility that the instructor sitting in the right seat noticed a light aircraft to the right and initiated an evasive maneuver, causing the Boeing to bank left. However, it is unclear why the cautious instructor allowed the bank to reach 45 degrees before correcting it. The likely cause of the catastrophe was identified as a crew error, as they failed to recognize and correct the excessive yaw of the aircraft, which ultimately led to the Boeing losing control, with insufficient altitude reserve to rectify the situation. Following the incident, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, of the United States prohibited training flights from practicing landing approaches with the failure of half the engines, noting that such situations could be simulated at higher altitudes. Additionally, modifications were made to the design of control surfaces, especially the rudder. Investigators also noted that while according to existing regulations, flight data recorders on airliners were only required to be activated during regular passenger flights and deactivated during training flights to conserve the foil on which flight data is recorded, in this case, the flight data recorder was not deactivated. This oversight significantly aided the investigation, unlike the Arlington crash, where the flight data recorder was turned off. As a result, on January 12, 1960, the Civil Aviation Board sent a recommendation to the Federal Aviation Administration that all new civil aircraft and already operational jetliners be equipped with flight data recorders, with the recorders required to operate during all flights, including training and test flights.